So, hello again, dear wonderful people of Africa, dear students, dear facilitators. Happy to welcome you to another of our exciting life lessons. Today is going to be unique. It's going to be unique in several senses. Uh, One is that we're going to have as our facilitator, our lecturer for the week, one of the leading lights in the area of worldview and science teaching and learning. He is based in the US because this is life. He's it will be like what time? It will be like 5 a.m. his time in Kalamazoo in the US. It's also unique in the sense that we continue to have our vice chancellors join us. The vice chancellor of the premier university of Nigeria, that's the first university in Nigeria, University of Ibadan, is here with us. A former Secretary General of the Association of Vice Chancellors of Nigeria Universities here. We have the serving Vice Chancellor of the University of Taisholari University of Education also here with us. And then we have our grandfather, Vice Chancellor and medical scientist, one of the leading lights in obstetrics and gynecology. I used to say that he was at some point, maybe virtually, the person who took delivery of these children in Buckingham Palace. And that's Professor Nimi Briggs is also here. We are going to start right away, and I'll start by sharing my screen with you, which indicates that we are in week 5 of our 3-month program, today being Tuesday, 5th of May 2020. Our program for today looks like this. I'm giving you the welcome now, and I will introduce in a minute our facilitator who will be giving us a lecture for 40 minutes on worldview theory. Worldview theory and science education research. After 40 minutes, we'll take question and answer. It may spend less than 40 minutes, which is fine. And then we'll have the announcement and the closing. Now, let's welcome our facilitator for today. Our facilitator from the US in Kalamazoo is Professor William W. Cobern, who holds the position of Distinguished University Faculty Scholar at the Marlinson Institute for Science Education, College of Arts and Science of Michigan State, University of Michigan University. He began his science education career as a high school biology and chemistry teacher. At the institute, he teaches a variety of courses for science teacher development and science education research. He has had active research programs funded by the National Science Foundation regarding factors that influence effective science teaching and learning. His current research efforts are to do with the relationship of trust in science knowledge and student understanding of the nature of science. He has been a guest lecturer in Australia, Brazil, Egypt, Germany, Japan, Lebanon, Malawi, New Zealand, Norway, Sweden, South Africa, Taiwan, and Turkey. Now, I'm going to insert Nigeria. It's doing alphabetically. I'm going to insert Nigeria here because it's also a guest lecturer in Nigeria at Lagos State University Africa Center of Excellence for Innovative and Transformative STEM Education. He's a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, a fellow of the American Scientific Affiliation, and a fellow of the American Educational Research Association. My pleasure, ladies and gentlemen, to ask Professor William W. Cobern to present his lecture. Over to you, Bill. Yes, we can hear you, Bill. Very loud and clear. Very loud and clear.
Oh, okay, good. I wasn't quite sure. So, good morning, everybody. Let's see if I can share my screen. This worked the other day. So let's see. Okay, how's that?
Yeah, it's good. We can see your screen.
All right. So, um, all right. So my it seems to be working on my end. So anyway, so this is the same group of people I spoke with last week, Peters.
Yes, of course, yes.
Okay, good. So welcome back. It's nice to be back here, even if it is five a.m. in the morning here. So I hope I've had my second cup of coffee, so I think I can.
Stay awake.
I think I can manage. Just as I spoke with you last week, our current work has to do with the nature of science, and to the extent people find that they trust scientific knowledge. But another area of my work, and an area that goes back all the way to the late 70s when I was lecturing in Nigeria, has to do with worldview theory. And so Peter asked me to talk about that, and so I thought I would. And I'm going to begin this talk by showing you a little story that a Nigerian professor shared with me back in the fall of 1979 when I first arrived in Sokoto. All right, so here it is. So I'll give you a moment to read this moral dilemma. What are we doing? Everybody got through it?
Oh, yes, of course.
Okay. Does everybody have an answer to the question at the end in their own mind?
Yes, I have though.
Okay. All right. So I have long forgotten the man's name who shared this little story with me. But he was doing this because I was a young man coming out of America, and he wanted to make sure that I understood that things were not going to be the same in Sokoto as I was accustomed to. And so he shared this story, and he asked me the question at the end: who would I save? All right, and I remember quite distinctly thinking, well, this is what we call a no-brainer. The answer is obvious. Okay, the answer is obvious. You save the child, right? And he then proceeded to laugh quite a bit, and he said, most of the people that you will meet won't say the child; they will say the parent, which I found quite astounding. And for 4 years after that, while I was lecturing in Nigeria, I decided to try this out as an introduction to some of my lectures, and I'd give this, and I'd ask my students there in Sokoto, and you know what? Most of the time, they said that the answer was the parent. And so I don't know what this group had in your minds when you answered this, but my students said the parents, and I've tried this some other places as well and gotten the same answer. I've also done it with my students here in the USA, and they follow true to form. Most of the time, if I ask this question here, the answer will be the child, and not one of the others. And so we could go on and talk culturally why people would answer this question differently. All right, it is a moral dilemma. You can't save everybody. So why would one person coming from one culture choose something differently than somebody else? And so the answer to that is that we have very different ways of seeing the world. We grow up in different parts of the world. We grow up in different cultures, and there's no question that I've grown up in the United States. Even though I've traveled a great deal, I have lots of characteristics that are just simply American. I've got friends who will say, "Oh, it's easy to tell Europeans from Americans. You can always tell them apart." Well, I don't know if that's true or not, but I know that I have friends who will say that. That is, you know, friends from, let's say, the Middle East and so forth will say something like that. And what is it then that's about people? Of course, I knew when I was in Nigeria that my Nigerian students could very quickly tell you about different students from different parts of Nigeria. And just like here, students, most of my students spoke Hausa as their first language, and they would laugh about the accent that somebody coming from the south had speaking Hausa in the north, and of course we do the same thing here. If you've been in the States very much, you know that there are different accents, and so sometimes people chuckle at the different accents people have. So the point is simply that we grow up in different parts of the world, even different parts of the country, and there are things about our culture that are part of our thinking that really become part of us. And this is what I'm referring to as, at least in terms of cognition, how we think and how we feel as worldview. That at a very fundamental level, the way we see the world is framed in a personal or social worldview that we bring to what we see. So when I come to that moral dilemma, that story, and I'm asked who I'm going to save, I'm coming to that from a whole series, a set of things that I know and things that I believe that that form the interpretive background for answering that question. So you don't just answer that question from no background. You answer that question from the background of your worldview. So what can we get more? Can we get more specific? Now, what does worldview mean? What is this thing? And if you look in the literature, you actually find a large number of vague definitions. In fact, quite a number of years ago, a philosopher of culture was writing that the word had become almost useless because you could find 100 different definitions for it. It's one of those words that can mean almost anything to people. I'm going to give you an example of something like that in a few minutes. So you see these vague definitions. It's one's view of the world. It's one's understanding of humanity or nature. It's your type of thinking. It's how you understand cause and effect. Who knows what people might say. And then sometimes we see this expression. This expression is found in American documents on science education. Now, not so much anymore, but certainly 20 years ago, when you looked at some of the national documents funded by the National Science Foundation and the American Association for the Advancement of Science, you would find this phrase, a scientific worldview. And the idea was that education in science should help people get a scientific worldview. And I'm thinking, no, I don't think that is the case. And let me explain. What I think is more acceptable to say is that what we would like to do is educate our children, students, so that they have a scientifically more compatible worldview as opposed to scientifically less compatible. So I'm making what I think is a very important difference in terminology. I don't think we should talk about a scientific worldview, but I do think it's very appropriate to talk about a worldview that's compatible with science. And I would hope that in education that's what happens, that worldviews that students bring to the classroom, they find compatible or become compatible with science. All All right, so why do I want to make this distinction? All right, now I suppose this is kind of a crazy diagram. It's just a set of boxes. I think my mouse works here. What I'm trying to picture in this image is that worldview up here. This isn't something like science as opposed to other things. This is a concept that captures the important aspects of your life. So, for example, everybody has religion or philosophy, even if it's not even if it's not thought through. There are some things that people believe to be ultimately important. Gender. I don't know of any society where gender doesn't have an influence on how we think and what we believe. SES is short for socioeconomic status. Again, I don't know of any society where a person's economic status doesn't have some impact on what they think and what they believe. Ethnicity. I mean, I can tell you, here in the U.S., we're pretty much a melting pot of people, but if you think of traditional Southerners as opposed to traditional New Englanders, it's not really an ethnic difference, but boy, there's certainly significant difference between those groups of people. And what I'm getting at is that when we talk about this fundamental view that we have, that we implicitly approach the world with, this is the interconnected set of ideas that we have from our philosophy, our religion, gender, from our socioeconomic status, ethnicity. And I'm not saying that this is an exclusive. There's probably other things we could add to this. What I'm trying to picture is that worldview is a comprehensive and complicated matter. It's going to be affected by many, many things in your personal development. If you grew up in Hausa land, that's going to be different from growing up in Igbo land. Isn't that correct?
Correct. Yes.
I think I think it is. Growing up in Alabama in the United States is different from growing up in Michigan. And that's going to bring about different ways of thinking about the world. And it's not that these can't change. Of course they change. Humans develop and humans grow. But nevertheless, we don't have a blank slate when we come, a mental cognitive blank slate, when we come to that moral dilemma that you read earlier. We come with a whole set of these implicit ideas. Now, what about science? My diagram shifted. You see, this is supposed to be science here. Well, what I'm trying to indicate in this diagram, if you're talking about science, well, you cannot divorce your views of science from the rest of your life. So whatever it is you happen to think about science, it's going to be influenced by religious and philosophical ideas. It's going to be influenced by gender. We know that there are huge gender issues in science. There's been a lot of problems with gender inequity in science, and I don't think the U.S. is the only place where this has been a problem, and trying to address it. Again, economic status, ethnicity, all of these things as a part of your worldview are things that influence how you understand science, which is why I think it is better to talk about a more scientifically compatible worldview than to talk about a scientific worldview. So I'm not willing to take this whole thing up here, okay, this outside box, and call that scientific. I'm going to say what's scientific, it comes within our worldview. So let me try to explain this a little bit differently, and I'll continue with some maybe you think odd diagrams. So I created this little diagram a long time ago. These are just frequency distributions, and I'm thinking, this is how I'm thinking. I'm thinking, all right, let's say you're a scientist here in the United States, in America. Let's say you're a scientist in India. Maybe you're in Mumbai. Maybe you're at the Tata Institute of Technology and Science in Mumbai, India. All right. So you have Indian scientists, and this could be in this could be in Nigeria or in Burundi. You can you can replace this scientist over here with somebody else. But here I am over here as an American, and if I think about if we try to think about the things that somebody in India growing up believes, what are I just referred to this as Eastern. What are the presuppositions, the attributes? I'll tell you one obvious thing: the difference in time. In a Hindu culture, the view of time is very different from the view of time that you would find certainly in North America. European Western civilization, not just America, is time is always linear. It's never circular, but it can be in other cultures such as India. And so my point is that if you could, if you look at a person in India, they're obviously Indian, and they're gonna be some things that virtually everybody thinks alike on, and then there'll be some things where only a few think, and over here a few think this, right? But the point is that here I am as an American, and you know what? That's a significant difference between this person over here and this person. My thinking as an American generally is going to be a lot different. It doesn't matter if I'm a scientist, science educator, a doctor, a farmer. My just general view of things, what I have grown up and learned, is going to be different. We live in very different cultures. All right. So, what if we could do a science worldview scale? All right. Let's just say, I don't think we can, but let's just say we could do a science worldview scale. All right, and now we just started looking at both Americans and Indians. Well, we would again find this sort of normal distribution. You'd have a lot of people here in the center. You'd have people over here not very scientific at all, and then remember that American scientist and Indian scientist back here. They're so different on this scale that has to do with Indian beliefs, Indian worldview. They're very different. But now we come to this scale that has to do with science, and they become very similar. So I don't expect my scientist friend in Mumbai to think about science much different from what I think about it. I don't want to say that they're perfectly alike, but there's going to be a lot of similarities in our science. But so we're going to be thinking about the nature of science and scientific inquiry similarly, right? Culturally, we may be very different, but when it comes to science, we're probably going to think about the nature of science and scientific inquiry somewhat differently. So, what are we talking about with science? I think there is a sort of scientific core, that we all agree on. I pretty much agree on that science is about natural phenomena. It's about scientific explanations, being naturalistic, empirical testing. Now, a lot of this you remember seeing in the nature of science, and this is a little bit different list because the nature of science oftentimes doesn't talk about things like science presupposes the possibility of knowledge, or that science presupposes that there's order in nature. But these are fundamental things that we believe about the world if we're involved in science. It's pretty difficult to do science and to teach science if you don't think that cause and effect works in nature, right? It's pretty fundamental. Science is a great deal of science is about understanding cause and effect in science, in nature, in the natural world. But let me get back here. All of these things, all of these core of scientific ideas, right? All of those things then are embedded in our worldviews. They're embedded in all of these other aspects of our lives. So that nobody then comes to science thinking exactly the same way as somebody else.
Sure.
So here's my definition for worldview. Worldview refers to a culturally dependent implicit. Implicit is important because we typically don't think about our worldview. When is the last time somebody thought that time is linear, it runs in one direction? At least if you're from a Western influenced culture. So it's implicit. These are the things we don't think about, but they do influence us. They are how we organize, or how our thinking is organized. And this organization is a set of presuppositions. By presuppositions, it's what we assume to be the case before we actually start thinking about something. It's not a matter of ever coming to any situation knowing with a complete blank slate. Whatever we come to, we come to it with something going on in our heads. And a lot of that is this concept of worldview. All right, this sounds awfully theoretical. Can we demonstrate this having any effect, especially if we're thinking about science and science teaching? So let me take a few minutes to give you some examples from some research that we did a number of years ago. If you go back to my core ideas about science, one of them is that science has to do with the natural world. All right, we don't use science to explain theology or spiritual things. We use science to explain, to give us concepts like photosynthesis or gravity or quantum mechanics. Science has to do with explaining, with understanding the natural world. It's about nature, right? To put it short, it's about nature. So in a study with high school kids who had been in science courses, of course, we thought, well, let's do something like this. Let's get some kids, some students, to start talking about nature, just nature. Because wouldn't you think that if our students start talking about nature, that they would use scientific concepts? Because if they had learned some science, and science had come to the point of influencing their thinking, then if you got them into a conversation about nature, surely they would say something about how nature is understood through science, or something like that. So I won't go into all the details for how we structured the interviews that this data comes from, except to say that we engaged some students and some science teachers individually in some conversations about the nature of science. And the one rule that we had is that the interviewer would never mention science until the interviewee mentioned it. Okay. All right, you got that? Yes. So I'm going to interview somebody. Well, let's say I'm going to interview Peter. Yes. I'm going to interview Peter about nature, and I've got a way of doing this. I've got some prompts to help him to respond to me and so forth. But the thing I'm not going to do is I'm not going to mention science. I'm going to wait to see if he mentions it. And then if he does mention it, I can ask him questions about it. But I am not going to mention it until he does. All right, so let's start with teachers. All right. So here's one of the teachers. This is just a short piece from an edited interview.
We have 10 more minutes, 10 minutes.
Okay. Yep. Nature is more powerful than the minds of people who are trying to conquer it. Nature is really not knowable. Oh, that was interesting. To me, to the mysterious nature of nature is one of its better qualities. So, we thought that was pretty interesting. Here's a science teacher who's talking about nature being mysterious. And where did that come from? Well, that comes from how he understands the world. That's not his science. That's how he understands the world coming to his science. How about this one? Mr. Hess. Look at this. I think everything has patterns. I feel that with enough scientific knowledge, everything will be understandable. Just think of the difference between this Mr. Hess and this Mr. Bradford. Well, where did all of these ideas come from? Again, they come from the background that he brings to science. Here's Mr. David. Nature is orderly, chaotic, predictable, unpredictable. It's a sort of a yin-yang relationship between the two. Well, here's an interesting thing. These science teachers, they all almost immediately brought science into the conversation. I didn't have to say anything. But what surprised me was how differently they spoke about science. Here's the fourth one, and this is the last teacher example I'll use. Actually, I don't have enough time to do the students, so we'll just be satisfied with the teachers. But look at Miss Jackson. I think nature is predictable, logical, explainable, right? We come up with laws of nature as scientists. I think you can understand nature, and you can know it and predict it. So I just ask you to take a moment and think about how different these four people are. And these were four veteran science teachers in a secondary school, and they all taught an introductory sort of integrated science course to first year secondary students, and they all had this good scientific background, and yet look at how differently they spoke about science. Now, do you suppose this makes any difference in the classroom? Well, one of the other things we did is that we interviewed students, and part of what the interviews was to show the students excerpts from the interviews with the teachers without telling them the teacher's name. And you know what? Yeah. The students were able to identify each of the teachers. So, for example, I didn't have to show Mr. Bradford's name. All I had to do was to show a few lines from his interview, and the students I spoke with said, "Oh, that's Mr. Bradford." Same thing with Ms. Just mentioned a few things that she said. They go, "Oh, that's Ms. Jackson." You know what that tells you? What that tells you is that these things that these teachers believe, they come across in the classroom. So when these teachers are presenting their science, let's say it's photosynthesis or friction or whatever it is, it comes across in the context of their worldview, how they understand science. Now, there's a lot more we could look at. Here was an interesting little study we did where we engaged students with some fictitious episodes that we wanted them to explain. All right. So here's an example that we showed our interviewees. All right. This is an episode, and then then we gave them two explanations. So here was one explanation. Now, if you read this explanation, it talks about déjà vu. You probably all know that French term. I think it's French, déjà vu. It's a sense that you've been in someplace before. If you read this explanation, there's not a very scientific explanation. Okay, it's a lot of very vague terms. So wouldn't exactly call that a scientific explanation. What about this one? All right. Now, in this particular study, none of these explanations are true. We we weren't trying to write true explanations, and we told students that we're not talking about true things. We're just talking about what somebody might be more convinced with. And anyway, so you've got two different kinds of explanations here. And one of the things we have learned is that some people prefer this explanation, but the more science background a person has, the more they like this explanation. So again, it's a sense of what we the kind of background that we come to in our science. So again, we ask, is this really important, or are these merely interesting questions? And we say it is important. As I mentioned, the students we interviewed were able to identify their teachers right away, and we say it's important because as teachers, we may inadvertently present science in ways that students find difficult to accept. When we interviewed students, we found students who talked about nature in a way that I think they would find it very difficult to be in the classroom with some of the teachers, because the teachers had very different views about nature. All right, and we say this not because of science. It's not the science itself, but because of the ways that we interpret science and the ways that we contextualize science for our students. And that is in my view, this is a critical lesson to learn, that when we have various disputes, and in my previous lecture talk, we talked about the controversial science of climate change and evolutionary science. We have to keep in mind that sometimes, even oftentimes, it's not so much the science itself, but how the science has been contextualized. The issue of climate change is a good example here in the U.S. It has been incredibly politicized.
3 minutes.
And now politics get in the way of the science, and that there's a lot of people who are to blame for that, because they couldn't resist putting important issues of science into a political context, whereas if it had been left out of politics, it wouldn't have been so influenced. So my point is that this happens in the classroom. We're in the classroom. We place science in context, and we need to make sure that at least we should give some thought to the possibility that the context in which we place science may inadvertently put science at risk, you might say. So the bottom line, the thing I want to end with, is simply that science doesn't exist outside of culture, but it exists within culture, and that goes for our students, the students in the classroom. And if the teacher comes from a somewhat different culture than the students do, teachers should be aware of it. That's why that Nigerian friend of mine, when I first arrived in Sokoto, gave me that moral dilemma. He wanted to make sure that I understood that my students and a lot of my colleagues were probably not thinking about a lot of things the way I thought was natural, and I needed to start learning how they were thinking about things so that I could do a better job as a teacher. So we would say a teacher's worldview influences the teaching of science, and a student's worldview influences the sense that a student makes of the science that's being taught in the classroom. Right? The teacher's worldview influences teaching, and the student's worldview has an influence. And as teachers of science educators, we should keep these things in mind. If we ignore these, and I do call them facts, if we ignore these facts, then we can invite difficulties for our students, difficulties that they wouldn't necessarily have if we were more culturally attuned to how we present science and how our students receive science. And that's my talk for this morning. I hope I'm about on time, Peter.
Excellent, excellent, excellent. You did very well. You did very well. Thank you so very much, Professor Bill Cobern,
You're
for
welcome.
for your very insightful, very deep uh, lecture. And I can see many of us bubbling to reflect with you on the subject or the theme of your lecture. I particularly like the position that you have taken about compatibility with science and worldview. Either it's compatible or like kind of continuum. How compatible is it with science, rather than saying you're just rigidly like a binary thing, one way or the other. So I deeply appreciate it. Your last two slides are quite instructive about contextualizing science and recognize that science should be delivered within the culture, and culture also affecting science. And we should also recognize that the teacher presents the science from his or her worldview, the student accepts or whatever science of their worldviews. So thank you so very much, Professor Bill. I now want to open up for questions or observations. We actually have 15 minutes for this. If you want to take the floor, please just indicate, and I will have a list of people that we will be calling on. Professor Mike Harrell, sir, you have the floor. Just unmute your microphone and roll with it. Yes, Professor Michael Harrell, waiting. So you can just take the floor now, sir.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much. I think the lecture of Mr. Cobern was very illuminating. As a lawyer, we tend to see worldviews as a way of validating position or discrediting the position. If you take the current debate over COVID now, we can see the clear distinction between Fauci, Bates, and Trump, and some of the conspiracy theorists all over the place. The scientific perspective is the one that is consistent with facts, logic, and of universal application. But when, as lawyers, we use this concept, we tend to maybe, quote unquote, abuse it to discredit a particular person. Oh, he's talking like a scientist. Is that scientific perspective? Worldview, realistic. Whereas he is the one that is giving that perspective a bad name. But from the lecture we have got this morning, I've seen a clearer picture of what constitutes worldview, which is that it's a combination of perspective, expectation, and your experience.
Wonderful.
But it must be consistent with facts and able to withstand scientific verification. And I think as a lawyer, I've learned a lot about that, and I'm a bit humbled about the fact that sometimes we carelessly deploy worldview into a debate that is scientifically not subject to that kind of treatment. And I think the law students, those law-minded persons among us will understand the depth of the insight.
Wonderful.
Professor's lecture has given. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir. Professor Mike Harrell, thank you very much, sir. Thank you, sir, for that explication. Now, we're going to have Faith Igbo. Faith Igbo, please take the floor.
All right. I want to first of all thank Professor Cobern. I usually find his lectures very interesting and informative. It makes me go back to think about the things he has spoken about. Now, that's my question. Now, putting those, I'm coming from your concluding slide, putting this conclusion into mind that the way we teachers teach science.
Can you raise your head a little bit, man? We're only seeing the top of your head. Can you raise it so that we can see you properly? Yeah,
right,
better now.
Okay, I was saying that. All right, sir. I said our worldview as teachers, if our worldview influences the way we teach, and in like manner, the worldview of the students influences the way they understand the lessons we give to them. My question is this: is there a way, if I put this into my mind consciously, is there a way as a teacher I can separate my worldview from a standard, the way science should be taught?
Wow.
Is my question clear?
Yeah, very clear. That's a very profound one. Yes, thank you very much, Fetigbo. Our grandpa, Professor Nimi Briggs, you have the floor, sir.
Mr. Chairman, I want to join others in thanking Bill for his lecture. Of course, there was no way I would have missed it because I thoroughly enjoyed his last address to the House. That said, I want to contribute in a very similar manner to Professor Rarele, the lawyer, which is that whatever influence culture has on bearings as we teach STEM, these bearings must be factual. They must be in tune with known and established facts.
Yes.
Gravity does exist. Gravity will pull anything that goes up down to the earth. A culture that is not compatible with that way of thinking will not stand the test of time. Photosynthesis is the process by which we are able to harness the energy from the sun to utilize that energy within our own system through the food we eat. And that's a scientific fact. Any culture that is aberrant with that sort of information based on the fact that I'm from a different culture will have problems. And this is why, with all due respect, our current president in the United States is having some problems because he does not seem to accept some basic scientific facts that are known and exist. Science matters. And as Bill did say at the last time he spoke to us, the world needs science to exist. And I thank him very strongly. And I think that that fact has to be impressed upon all speakers.
Yes, sir.
That scientific information is the way by which the Almighty God lets us have access to what He has done. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so very much, sir, Professor Briggs. Oladejo, you have the floor. Oladejo, just hold on. Let me just mute everybody, and then you unmute yourself. So, Oladejo, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, sir.
Pleasure.
Thank you, Professor William, for that wonderful lecture again. It's a pleasure having you around today. My contribution is a friend of mine in this lecture, Dr. Frank, once presented a paper on border crossing. And I think that for teachers in the science classroom, this issue of science and culture being dependent on one another is an issue that will continue to reign in the class. And my angle of it is that's where you said scientifically more compatible view of the world. From the teacher training institutions, we should make our science teachers to understand that, okay, from what Fitz-Ibu said, this is your culture. This is the scientifically more compatible angle to this thing. And when you blend together, do not use your own culture. Do not impose it on the learners. Rather, when you get to your class as teachers, since you would get the capacity of your learner, try to find out what your learners have as in view of that angle of the science and see how you can gently cross them over to the scientifically more compatible angle that will seem more reasonable and that they can always follow suit. That's my contribution. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Alade Okin, take the floor.
Thank you, sir.
Pleasure.
Good morning. From my own understanding of this presentation this morning, I can see that we have many worldviews about the nature of science. And there are many cultural implications in the ways we view the nature of science. For instance, in Africa, we have African mythology, we have British mythology, American mythology, Indians, they have their own mythology too.
Can you pronounce sorry, Alade Okin, can you pronounce it mythology rather than mythology?
Mythology.
Thank you.
Mythology. Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
Now, sir, can there ever be a meeting point with all these views about the nature of science? The way a Yoruba man will perceive the nature of science will quite be different from an Hausa man's perspective. And we are teaching the same concept in the class. Would there ever be a meeting point or a blending point for all this mythology so that we can arrive at a progressive point. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. We'll go on to Malirambona. You have the floor. Okay, Bill, we're yielding to you now. Malirambona, we're not able to reach him. Can you please comment on some of the comments and answer the questions? Bill, you have the floor.
Myself. Okay.
Yeah.
There we go. So yes, I took a few notes here. I didn't quite catch everything. I think a question came up about whether it's ever possible to free science teaching from worldview, or for the teacher to be perhaps to step out of her or his worldview and then teach science. I'm not sure I got that question correctly, but if that's close to what the question is, then I have to say no. Nobody's going to step out.
Nobody's going to step out. I agree with you. Nobody's going to step out now.
You can recognize.
Yes.
You can recognize what influences you.
Sure.
And you can try to make sure that something that influences you that's outside of science doesn't influence the way you teach science. That leads me to the question about border crossing. I know Glenn Aiken did a lot of writing. We did one paper together and we talked about this concept of border crossing. And there are borders between how people think about science. You can think of well-known scientists in the world today. And if you know much about them, you realize that, oh, well, they are scientists. They have, somebody asked about whether different perspectives, mythologies can come together. Well, they do. Scientists come together all of the time. They speak with one another. Science teachers speak with one another. But if you know any of these scientists very well, you can quickly discover that they do have very different perspectives.
Correct.
I mean, all you have to do is take somebody like one of they're called the new atheists. They're the promoters and proselytizers for atheism, like Jerry Coyne or Richard Dawkins. Somebody like that has science embedded in this deep commitment to there being no God, right? Yeah. And that's how they think about science. Well, there's a lot of other scientists who would disagree. I'm trying to think of his name. Here in the U.S., he's the person who led the Human Genome Project. I can't think of his name at the moment. Skip my mind. But I know that he's a theist. He's a follower of Jesus, so he's very different. But if you got the two people in a room, they can talk about science without necessarily getting into other issues, and that's basically what teachers need to be aware of. If I have a classroom where there are cultural differences, I should try to be aware of what those are. I don't know that this idea can work everywhere, but in working with teachers here in the U.S., what I've always encouraged teachers to do is to open units with general conversations about the subject matter. Here's what we're going to be studying. Do you know anything about this? What do you think about this? Why do you think this might be important? In other words, the idea is to try to engage students in a conversation that allows them to talk about the science from their own perspective.
Wonderful.
And getting that out in the open helps students to feel that, their ideas are valuable, and it gives the teacher some perspective on how she might approach the teaching of the lesson. Now, that open discussions by students is probably not going to work in all cultures,
yes. But we have to round up in 1 minute now. 1 minute,
Well, that's about it.
Yes, thank you very much.
I'll yield back to you, Peter.
Thank you so very much, Professor Bill W. Cobern, for that wonderful lecture. As Professor Nimi Briggs said, we enjoyed the first one. Now, this is the second one, which you have also thoroughly enjoyed. I'm sure that if in the future we have a third one coming, it will be the best of the pack. It's now time for us to show appreciation to you. And who else to ask other than our grandpa, Professor Nimi Briggs? Professor Nimi Briggs, by the way, was Vice Chancellor of the University of Port Harcourt 1 million years ago. While he was there, he was the chairman, committee of vice chancellors of all the universities in Nigeria, and he won the best vice chancellor of the year award, not given by students group, which I find very ridiculous, because I can see somebody says it's the best vice chancellor in Nigeria given by students. I mean, what do the students know about vice chancellor? So I'm quite delighted that Professor Nimi Briggs is here with us, and I'm going to ask him to please make this presentation of the plaque to our plaque of appreciation to Bill W. Cobern. Over to you, sir, Professor Nimi Briggs.
Well, Bill, this is stated as coming from Lagos State University, but I'm sure you would think it that it's from Lagos State University, and indeed all of us.
Yes.
The Lagos State University Africa Center of Excellence for Innovative and Transformative STEM Education, which is a World Bank sponsored project. This is to certify that Professor William W. Cobern facilitated courses ACE 813 and ACE 913 between May 4 to May 9, 2020. And this is signed by Distinguished Professor Peter Okebokola, Officer of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, who is serving as the director of the program.
Thank you. Thank you so very much, sir. Thank you, Professor Nimi Briggs, our grandpa. And I'm going to unmute everybody so that we will. I will meet you in a minute, but just let me make an announcement. The announcement is that we are done for today. We go and enjoy ourselves and enjoy the lesson. You recall that in the morning, Professor Nimi Briggs said he just finished having breakfast and that he's going to invite us to breakfast. So we're all going to assemble in Port Harcourt.
Yes.
All our students from Ghana, all the students.
No entry into Port Harcourt. No entry.
No entry. Oh, you are using that as a as an excuse. Well, we will enter. All our students from Ghana, from Burundi, from DRC, and from Nigeria, we're all going to assemble in Port Harcourt, whether there's entry or not. We're going to enter the place. We thank Professor Mike Karale, we thank Vice Chancellor, University of Ibadan, we thank all of you, for being part of this. So let me unmute everybody and let's give a round of applause. Let's give a round of applause to thank you. Thank you so very much, and we'll see you tomorrow.